I'm so excited to announce that I have released the first official tarot diagnosis spread book. Tarot and Self-Discovery is a therapeutic tarot journey with over 200 spreads, including over 152 card prompts and over 50 robust tarot spreads. You can purchase a physical copy on Amazon or a digital copy at thetarotdiagnosis.com. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. I'm having one of those months where I feel like I seem to be having or experiencing the same conversation with a handful of clients every single week. So I found myself saying some form of, quote, what would it feel like if you stepped into a place of neutrality about this, end quote. And I feel like it's just been appropriate to ask that several times, like throughout the last few weeks with multiple people. And it's really fascinating because it seems to stop clients dead in their tracks. And I mean hard stop, like eyes wide, brain suddenly removed from this space of, heightened activation. And then the client starts to appear more present and less stressed. And their response is always something like, oh, I hadn't considered that. That actually feels good. Or they say it feels freeing, or something similar along those lines. So, of course, I start thinking about the application of this method or way of thinking to tarot. So neutrality is usually thought of in terms of ethics and research, where there's an actual term called value neutrality. So, side note, that's why the title of this episode got its name. It's based on this idea of value neutrality in research. But within that world, value neutrality is the practice of maintaining impartiality and avoiding bias when interpreting and presenting findings. But this concept of neutrality doesn't just exist within the container of research or academia. I feel like it's something that we can integrate into every aspect of our lives, especially into our tarot practice, because those of us who use tarot for self-reflection and self-discovery and insight and personal healing, it is inevitable that we are going to experience intense emotions and feel activated because we know and experience the tarot to function as a mirror especially into our unconscious. The psychological value of neutrality lies really in its ability to help regulate our emotions. So when we're caught up in a situation, it can be so easy and quick and just automatic sometimes for us to become so emotionally activated, where we end up becoming reactive from this place of heightened emotion. And these heightened emotions I'm talking about are typically, fear, anxiety, anger, embarrassment, all of these, intense emotions that tend to accompany reactivity. And when we're in that space, our judgment can be pretty significantly clouded, which makes it difficult to really see the situation for what it is and have a kind of clear view of really what's going on and have clarity in order to make decisions that are what's best for us and best for the people around us. So by stepping into a place of neutrality, we end up creating kind of like a buffer between ourselves and the situation, especially the heavy emotions or intensity that the situation has elicited. Now, this doesn't mean that we're ignoring our emotions or pretending like they don't exist. It's more about acknowledging them without letting them take over. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a while or you've followed any of my work, this might sound familiar. And that's because it's very similar to the concept of radical acceptance, which is a concept that exists within the framework of dialectical behavior therapy, where we acknowledge that something has happened and we acknowledge that we cannot control what's happened, we can control how we react and what we do moving forward. So it's kind of similar. Not entirely similar, but maybe adjacent. So when we engage with neutrality, we can approach these situations with greater clarity, which allows us to create space for that buffer, like I was talking about a second ago, and allows us to be more thoughtful, intentional, and deliberate with how we are responding and reacting. Because when we're reacting, it ends up creating this like cascade effect of emotionality. And if this is involving another person, then we end up in this space where, we're communicating or we're listening to respond instead of listening to understand, and nothing ever gets done or accomplished, and it's not fun. So this whole practice of neutrality can actually be beneficial not only to the way we show up in relationships, but also to our relationship to tarot. When we're pulling cards, we are stepping into our unconscious. And this is a space that is riddled with deep emotions, subconscious fears, lots of shadows. So think about how we react to the more tense cards in the deck. So the cards that immediately come to mind are the Tower, Three of Swords, Ten of Swords, the Emperor is another big one, and the Hierophant. Those tend to be the most emotionally charged cards for folks. So what would it look like if we viewed those particular cards, for example, through a neutral lens? What if we allowed ourselves to see the cards just for what they are? Symbols, stories, and mirrors to our inner world, without existing within this space of emotional reactivity to them. Let's look at the Tower. So this is a card that often brings up intense feelings of fear or dread because traditionally it symbolizes having an experience of sudden destruction, upheaval. I mean, no one likes to see this building on fire and people tragically falling to their death. It's a very emotionally charged card. So our immediate reaction is, oh my God, I have to brace myself for disaster. But if we approach the Tower from a space of neutrality, we can start to see what exists beyond the inherent chaos that it typically represents. So instead of fixating just on the destruction or the fear, when we shift into a place of neutrality, it allows us to be curious about what's happening within us. It allows us to be curious about our reaction. And then it gives us this opportunity to relate to the card in ways that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have been able to relate to it. So if we were to, and it can be tricky because I think when we talk about neutrality, we automatically want to step into this positive reframe space. And that's not always the case because the positive spin on the Tower is that it's viewed as an opportunity for change. That's typically like if we're wanting to have a less reactionary response to the Tower, we say, oh, but look, we can change. We're creating space for something new. Isn't that exciting? We're not going to be stagnant anymore. We're going to be able to grow. So this shift in perspective doesn't diminish the intensity of the card, but it does allow us to engage with a different level of meaning. And it creates a space for insight rather than panic. However, a more neutral stance, I think, would be to just be curious and to ask ourselves, what change am I afraid of? Where is this fear coming from? What's within my control? What is outside of my control? These types of questions, because being able to ask ourselves and explore this curiosity based on a card like the Tower is going to be so much more helpful than just straight up freaking out about it. When we pull a card that triggers a strong negative reaction, I view it as an opportunity to explore our relationship with that card. And then by extension, the message or the interpretation that it represents. So this is actually where neutrality becomes especially valuable because instead of reacting defensively or even dismissively, we can step back and ask ourselves, well, what do I need to learn from this card? What do we need to learn from the discomfort that it brings? How can I reframe my understanding of this card in order to incorporate the valuable lessons that it holds and incorporate that into my everyday life, my personal narrative, the way I view myself, the way I view my relationships? The list can go on. This can get tricky though, because I would argue that the emotional reaction that we have to a card actually holds more weight than the actual meaning or interpretation of the card itself. So I feel like I'm kind of walking a thin line here. I don't want to say, hey, stop having emotional reactions to cards, because no, like that's why tarot is so beneficial, because it does elicit a reaction. But if we, I guess what I'm saying is if we end up shifting all the way to a neutral standpoint and we're not allowing space for everything to exist, we might actually lose valuable data. So I think the goal here is to notice the emotional reaction, acknowledge that it exists, and then move into a more neutral space. So the goal isn't to just experience tarot as a neutral entity entirely. It's to be able to notice and acknowledge, okay, I'm having a reaction. How do I step into a space of neutrality? Because when I step into a space of neutrality, then I'm able to have a full, well-rounded experience with the card and not just a one-sided, shallow experience with the card. Otherwise, readings become really flat and lack depth, especially when we're stuck in a heightened emotional state, because then, we're only functioning from a very specific part of the brain. We're not fully engaged with all parts of that system. So this is where it almost reminds me of like one of my favorite quotes, and the quote's typically attributed to Viktor Frankl, who says, and this is not verbatim, but it's something along the lines of between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is the power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So, he's talking about in between stimulus and response. So stimulus would be the card and response would be our emotional reaction. There's a space. So we have the card, we have the stimulus, and we have an immediate reaction. And sometimes that space between the reaction and the stimulus is a millisecond. So we just need to be aware, like, oh shit, I'm about to have this experience. It's probably going to be a little uncomfortable. You can feel the emotions. And then what you do after that is what is most important. So basically, neutrality allows us to shift from a place of reactivity to a place of presence and intention. It seems to be more about allowing ourselves to be fully engaged with a situation or a reading without being overwhelmed by it. It's really the ability to hold space for whatever arises without judgment, without attachment. And that doesn't come naturally to the majority of us. This is really what doing the work is about. Noticing when these things happen and releasing the attachment we have and being curious about the situation, or in this case, the card. So tarot provides an opportunity to not just practice this concept of neutrality, but also confront our shadows and grow, not by bypassing the discomfort, but instead by sitting with it and being curious about it, and then ultimately learning and growing. So this actually makes me think about internal family systems and parts work. I'm specifically thinking about the book No Bad Parts, where we can apply this same concept to the cards. So often, we will freak out over these cards that we deem bad or negative, like the Tower, the Three of Swords. But we're missing something by staying in that mindset. So, for example, I was just doing a reading for someone recently, and the reading was focused on interpersonal relationships. And the cards I pulled were not great. I'm talking reverse Ace of Cups, reverse Seven of Pentacles, and then the Five of Cups. And my quick and dirty interpretation of that was that the person was feeling like they were the only ones putting an effort into their relationships, and they were feeling a sense of loss and emptiness over not having any sort of relational reciprocity. And then the kicker, I pulled another card for words of wisdom or advice, and I pulled a Three of Swords. I was like, really? Come on. Can we not kick this person while they're already down, please? And I was having this reaction because I was like, oh my God, this person, like this reading's not that great. And not that every reading has to be good. I was just I was projecting. I was feeling bad. Like, oh, like I hope this person is like actually feeling supported by their friends and family because the cards suggest otherwise. And, I was having this experience of, reading the Three of Swords pretty traditionally, but then I had this realization and I moved myself from this reactionary place into more of a state of neutrality about the Three of Swords. And it took maybe 30 seconds because, I had this reaction to the card and I was like, oh, yeah, like this hurts. And then I was like, I feel like there's more here. I'm missing something. I'm stuck in my reaction to the card, and being stuck in my own personal reaction to the card was impacting my ability to offer a more robust and deeper interpretation of what was happening. So I noticed this in myself, and I gave myself a second to pause. And then I was like, I need to be a little bit more neutral about my experience here. And when I did that, I felt like it ended up allowing me to enter into a space where I had access to more depth. So I explored how this particular, card of that, traditionally represents heartbreak was still the swords, and being the suit of swords or being the suit of stories and cognition and intellect might actually be nudging the person to explore the stories that they're telling themselves about these relationships that is contributing to the pain or discomfort that they're feeling. And maybe nudging them to ask, which of these stories is rooted in truth and reality, and which ones are maybe distorted or rooted in bias. So without stepping into that place of neutrality, I wouldn't have been able to be as curious. And therefore, I felt like the reading would have just been kind of flat. We can also use the same concept with a card like the Emperor. This card is traditionally associated with authority, control, and structure. And it's a difficult card for a lot of people, I think, because it can feel really rigid and overbearing and triggering. There's a lot of discomfort and resistance that folks experience with this card. But when we step into neutrality, we give ourselves permission to be curious. And again, there's a fine line between neutrality and curiosity, and then toxic positivity. So let's look at the difference here. So a positive reframe of the Emperor would be that it's a card of stability and leadership and, reminding us how important boundaries and discipline is in our life. And instead of seeing it as a force to rebel against or be angry about, we can explore how the Emperor might be guiding us to take control of a situation in our own life. So that type of approach opens up some new possibilities for how we can understand and even work with this card moving forward. We're essentially creating a more nuanced interpretation. However, the Emperor as neutral is simply a card that either enjoys order or likes to be the person giving orders. This goes back to the concept of attachment I spoke about briefly a second ago. We don't necessarily have to attach any sort of deep meaning to the card. It just is what it is. And then you can ask yourself, in what ways am I the Emperor? In what ways do I embody this type of energy? So that actually reminds me of shadow work. And we know the shadow represents behaviors or feelings within us that we don't want to acknowledge. We want to push away. We've repressed. We don't want to admit that we are capable of experiencing or feeling those types of, or have that type of ability to exist in that space. In fact, there's a book called Meeting the Shadow by Ken Wilber. And he says, if a person or thing in the environment informs us, then we probably aren't projecting. On the other hand, if it affects us, chances are that we are victims of our own projections. And through that lens, stepping into a place of neutrality allows us to then be informed by a card. And again, I want to just keep reiterating there's a fine line here because we don't want to create a sterile relationship with our cards. And I think that it could be easy to go too far into a place of neutrality where it does become sterile. So we can even ask ourselves, am I being informed by this card? Or am I projecting? Now, we are always projecting onto the cards. That's what makes them so valuable. So this is where it gets a little tricky. So we can then maybe ask ourselves, okay, here's my projection. This is what I'm realizing is happening to me with this card. Now, how can I be informed by it? So really, it's about honoring both experiences. But often we don't give ourselves the opportunity or the space to honor both of those experiences. So to talk more about this concept of projection, if we apply this idea of projection to the Emperor, it suggests that individuals affected by this archetype and then express strong feelings towards this card may possess similar traits of seeking power and control, since these traits are part of their shadow. They distance themselves from them by the way of projection. They might express disgust or verbally criticize people who exist in that space. They might scoff, roll their eyes, or label the card as quote unquote bad. Those types of reactions really only deepen the shadow though, because especially with shadow work and recognizing these projections, the goal is to use them as opportunities for self-discovery rather than becoming trapped in a cycle of judgment and avoidance. With the Emperor, it can feel terrifying to acknowledge that you might be someone capable of engaging in controlling behavior because, we've deemed it bad or an abusive trait. And it's not inherently bad or wrong to have controlling traits or enjoy being in a position of authority. It's how you handle yourself when you are in control or have power that matters. So are you someone who's using this trait from a place of benevolence or malevolence? I also want to say, I think it's important to remember that those of us who are drawn to tarot have consciously opted to use a system that presents both light and shadow, both comfort and challenge. And this choice suggests that we really do seek a balanced perspective. We can just get lost sometimes. We want the good with the bad. We want the uplifting with the confronting, because we recognize that true growth comes from experiencing and facing all parts of ourselves, not just the ones that are so easy to digest. And like I said, it's easy to lose sight of that sometimes, especially when we aren't checking in with ourselves and expressing curiosity about our reactions. So, my challenge or invitation to you all is to ask yourself, what would it feel like? What would it look like if I stepped into a place of neutrality with myself, with my relationships, with my tarot practice? I think that after a little while of getting into the habit of being curious and allowing yourself to exist within a neutral space, you might be surprised at the level of clarity or even empowerment or peace that you start to feel. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.